My foster parents ruined my childhood, so I ruined their life. My parents passed away in a hit-and-run car accident when I was 10 years old. My dad was only 39, and my mom was 35. Neither of my parents had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small, church-going town where everyone knew each other. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune, so I didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big cities, so he and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. When they passed, I would have had to go the orphanage route, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made a big show in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time, so I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringeworthy like that. The Banks family had their own daughter, Ella, who was a year older than me. That should have meant we'd be super good friends, but Ella had her own thing going on and always ignored me. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I turned 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my parents' inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private, it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in our small town. In front of other people, they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Ella be nice to me in public, which she hated. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check on me. They'd coach me before the lady came and tell me to talk about how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on anything they wanted. Nice dinners, vacations, etc. It was clear to me, even as a teen, that the Banks family were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest, they spent on themselves. As I grew older, I could see that my foster parents pretended to have great business acumen, boasting that this was why they had more money. They'd use this as an excuse for buying a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is a big deal. And for taking trips to New York or buying fancy clothes for Ella. When I was 17, I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling my trust fund money to pay for Ella's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the Banks would never outright say so, but they heavily implied that I owed them. They suggested that once I got control of my inheritance, I should be godly and generous, and give them material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got plenty of material things, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store. She kept them for herself, gave them to Ella, or handed them off to her relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive Baroque-era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. It wasn't a replica. It was the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might have eaten steak off those plates. Probably not. You get the point. That china set was mine, of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how this china set would go to Ella on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy, I didn't care for all my mom's antiques. Ones Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, or for the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things are just things and that I should never obsess over them. Having the china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away, which was so wrong. Once Ella went off to college, thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. I could easily pay for it with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. As usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were telling me about how I owed them compensation. Since I was going to be rich soon, they said I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years, they had probably stolen or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused.